playing on the final night of Tribeca Film Festival. In fact, it's the closing film at Tribeca this year, is Yanuni. It's a 2 hour long documentary, approximately 2 hour long documentary directed by Richard Ladkani, and it follows Juma. Juma is an indigenous rights activist, and it's been a very long time since Juma has been fighting to stop the ecocide in the jungles of Amazon. So, just to give you some context, the Brazilian government, earlier it was led by Bolsonaro, which is who's a right wing leader, and now it's led by Lula. The Brazilian government has not been prioritizing the interests and the well being of the indigenous people. In fact, once Lula came to power, the Brazilian government even created that they formed like a ministry of indigenous people, and even then, a lot of issues, a lot of burning, pressing issues of the indigenous people have for a long time gone, have not been listened to. They have been ignored. A lot of some of these issues include the illegal mining and the ecocide in the in the indigenous lands of the Amazon. A lot of Another major burning issue here is the infestation of waters by mercury, because there are a lot of non-indigenous people who are illegally mining in the areas in the indigenous lands, as a result of which a lot of mercury contaminates the water, and this mercury infested water is extremely harmful to the indigenous people. And Juma, who is the subject of this documentary, is protesting against this illegal mining and the ecocide, which she says is not very different from the genocide. In fact, when a genocide happens in Amazon, she says it's not very different from the ecocide. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, Juma has for a long time been protesting against uh, this ecocide in Amazon, and as a result, it's Richard who follows her through as she goes on this journey, trying to protect her indigenous people, her own people, from this devastation. The documentary opens with a scene where Juma, and along with her indigenous people, marches towards the parliament, and the police, which is under the control of the Bolsonaro government, they start shelling tear gas. That is when Juma falls to the ground. One of her indigenous people are also injured. I think he's in a very bad condition. In fact, these protests are very commonplace throughout the documentary. It is only when Lula government comes to power is when Juma is finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. There is a Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, and it's almost like life coming a full circle. I think in the beginning of the documentary we see her protesting on the streets, and then when the Lula government comes in and forms this Ministry of Indigenous People, Juma actually enters the parliament building legally, because now she has legal rights as an indigenous person. Richard also follows Juma's partner Hugo. He's a part of IBAMA. The sole purpose of IBAMA is to stop these illegal mining activities, and that is why Richard follows Hugo across three IBAMA missions. In all of these three missions, there is a lot of, I would say, high risk. Fighting involved, because in one scene there are choppers flying, the chopper lands, and Hugo tries to neutralize a lot of these non-indigenous people who are encroaching on the rights of the indigenous people. It's a really high stake documentary which will keep you engaged. My only complaint with this documentary is that sometimes, and the key word here is sometimes, it can come across as a bit theatrical. In fact, especially the scenes where Hugo and Juma are actually bonding with each other, and they are perhaps speaking to each other via phones, via video calls. I personally felt that some of those scenes were slightly rehearsed or orchestrated. Now, I may be wrong, but you don't have to take my word for it. You can watch the documentary on your own to form your own opinion about this. However, there is no way that I can deny that this documentary is extremely important. I think watching this is the need of the hour, because it's been a long time since indigenous people have been denied their rights the world over. In fact, I want to bring here a quote that Juma says at the COP summit. She literally says that the ecocide hasn't been enabled just by the Brazilian government. In fact, it has been enabled by governments across the world. So Richard has done a really good job at documenting some of the more important aspects of the indigenous rights that are often not spoken about, and choosing Juma as as the subject of this documentary, as someone who is at the center of the cause that all the indigenous people are fighting for. I think that choice itself is extremely important and powerful. I would highly recommend you to watch this documentary as it premieres on the closing night of Tribeca. And with this, my watch has ended. I thank you so much for all of you, those of you who have regularly watched my Tribeca reviews. You can keep in touch, you can keep following me, as there is a lot of good content that's coming up after the festival ends.